Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzifeay. Apparently it's World Poetry Day today, and I have in fact got a poet in the book bag. I didn't know it was World Poetry Day. It's completely accidental, but let's go with the synchronicity of that. I've also got my book bag prepared. Girl, goddess, queen. We are going to be talking about a particularly fearsome goddess and queen and girl. But it's not Rachel Spence. Rachel Spence, the poet, is not fearsome at all. I'm going to welcome her into the book bag now. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Suzi. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
On World Poetry Day, no less. Did you know it was World Poetry Day?
I did know it was World Poetry Day. There are so many days now for different things that I kind of lose track. But yeah, we can't have enough poetry. So World Poetry Day has to be a good thing. And I am very honoured to be here on World Poetry Day. Yeah.
For you and I, every day is World Poetry Day, let's face it. So we are here to talk about your new book, Daughter of the Sun, but I've also got this lovely pamphlet as well, Furies, a nice signed pamphlet. And there's a kind of binding thread, I think, in a way, that you love sonnets. I love sonnets. You love sonnets. What is it about the sonnet form that's so compelling?
Oh, thank you. I do love sonnets. Well, for Daughter of the Sun, which is the first half, is a sequence of sonnets written to and about my mother as she fell ill and went into remission and then fell ill again and finally passed. So the first half of that sequence came out in a pamphlet called Call and Response. And it was quite a big risk for me to write them because sonnets, well, my mother and I had a lot of darkness in our relationship, as well as a lot of love and light. And those poems reflect that. And as I wrote them, I thought no one will ever read these. I was just sort of writing free verse. So I was very free with it and with the emotion. And then when I realized there was something there that was very specific that I wanted to say about my mother and I, and that probably had some resonance beyond just myself, I thought, how do I do this? And I thought of the sonnet form because sonnets were originally love poems. Petrarch used them, Shakespeare obviously used them. And I thought, if I choose a form that kind of has in its DNA the notion of being a love poem, maybe I will stay in the light with my mother. I will stay in a space of love. And so I didn't really think about it any more than that. There are 14 lines, which obviously a sonnet has to be. They're not strict. There's not a strict rhyme scheme. I use a bit of iambic pentameter, which I write in quite naturally. But it seemed to work because my mother loved the poems, and I couldn't publish them without her blessing. I would never have published them if she hadn't been happy. So I think the sonnet for me it's a perfect little architecture of love and light, and that it includes when the poem carries darkness. Also, it's a twisty little thing. I mean, theoretically, you have a kind of volta on the sixth line from the end, and that kind of shifts the poem. And my voltas are not on the sixth line. And I don't really think about when I'm doing them, but I notice that when I write a sonnet, I naturally twist from one place to another, from one time to another. And there's something about that form, because it's very tight, that curiously makes you more agile, I think, as a poet. Whereas in free verse, there's so much space. There's so much possibility. You can overwrite, you can get a bit weighed down. Whereas the sonnet, somehow, it won't work unless you stay just very light-footed. So that's why I love them.
I mean, it's amazing like you say, the structure, the architecture of them, you can still say a tremendous amount. And quite often the Volta it's a natural thing. It's such a short poem, but it's never just one thing. And it's sort of the traditional, 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines. You kind of have a thought, develop the thought, kind of go on with the thought, and then change it, and then conclude. So within 14 lines, you can actually have an argument and an emotion. And I mean, I just think it's a fascinating form. I would add Sir Philip Sidney, a brilliant sonneteer as well. So that's what sort of initially attracted me to this collection and what you've done with it. It tells a whole story. It's very moving, and it charts a relationship. And I'm fascinated to hear that you did run it past your mum, because you didn't need to. Well, you obviously felt that you needed to.
I absolutely did feel I needed to. I mean, as most writers will tell you, we terribly want to be published, and we think we'll do anything to be published. But actually, so I wrote these poems, then I absolutely rewrote them into sonnets, and then I sent them to a publisher, thinking, oh, probably nobody will want them. But the first publisher I sent them to, the wonderful Emma Press, who published Daughter of the Sun, wanted them. And then I had this dilemma, but it wasn't even a dilemma. I just thought, my relationship with my mother was genuinely very difficult for quite a long time. And there's a sonnet in the book where I think I say January 2013, Commercial Street. I'm between a broken boiler and a country I can't afford to visit. I'm waiting for a visa, and my mother rings me. And it's this moment where, the fact that we're pretty much estranged is very clear. And so when Emma Press said they wanted to publish the sonnets, I thought, we've worked so hard to heal this relationship. By then, Mum and I were, very loving and close again. And surely nothing is more important than that. And it wasn't. So I knew I had to show them to her. And she was a very brave, resilient, and a very kind of honest person. And I think when she read the sonnets, she realized that, they were honest about the darkness and light in our relationship, and this kind of chiaroscuro weave that we had. But I don't think she would have had it any other way. And she realized they were love poems. She said that they made me cry in a good way. And then she always called them my poems. When are you going to read my poems? They were her poems, not even our poems. But that was great. And I really admired her for the sort of emotional kind of courage it took to let those poems go out there. Yeah.
I mean, there's a grumpiness in some of the poems as well. This is a grumpy daughter, being a bit resentful and struggling with emotions. And I suppose it's a banal question whether it brought you closer. It sounded like, you had already become close by that point, but it certainly didn't cause any ructions.
Well, it did bring us closer, definitely, in lots of really concrete ways. I mean, we were already close. The sonnets came out so the first pamphlet came out in 2020. It's called Call and Response. And it's the first half of the sonnet sequence in this. And when Emma said they wanted to publish Call and Response, and my mum said, yes, I'd love you to, it was scheduled for actually, curiously, not only is it World Poetry Day, but it was scheduled for today. It was the 20th of March, Friday, the 20th of March in 2020, which was lockdown. It was the week we all went into lockdown. So we had to cancel the launch, the main launch, the what they call it, IRL launch. But Emma, who was still young and very kind of innovative, said there's this thing called Zoom. We can do it on Zoom. So we did the launch on Zoom. It was one of the very first poetry launches on Zoom ever, certainly in the UK. I think it was the first. And my mum could come to that. We hooked her up on Zoom with my dad. And it was a really joyous experience. So I think she just loved that feeling of being, because they are love poems to a mother. So I think she loved that feeling of being recognized as a good mother, as a mother who loved, who was loved. But simultaneously, the newspaper that I mainly write for when I'm being an arts journalist, which is my other head, which is the Financial Times, they asked me if we would do a diary of lockdown, a mother and daughter's diary, and tie it in with the call and response publication. So Mum wrote one half and I wrote the other, and we wrote, and it was actually very funny because she was a great writer and she was very funny, much funnier than me. So she wrote this very witty piece about the bossy daughter. I was called the BD, and I was always ringing up, making sure they weren't like breaking lockdown or walking the dogs in the woods, or all the things that this very feisty woman was always, she was always breaking rules. And so actually we got this fantastic spread in the Financial Times, and and she had her name there. But I mean, it was also her writing. I just bounced off her writing when I did my half. And I kind of was funnier than I am usually. I don't think of myself as a funny writer. But so, for her, that launched her actually into a writing phase. So her last year, she was writing a lot. She was writing a lot of articles for magazines. So it was fun. We had so much fun with it. And I feel like still, although she died in June 2021, but I mean, the second half of the sequence of sonnets is really about navigating loss and swimming in the river as a way of navigating loss. And I feel she's there, I feel she's there and she's watching me, and I talk to her and she's still really enjoying it. I mean, Daughter of the Sun's had like lovely events around it, and there are a few more to come. And Mum's always there going, yeah, go girl, this is great, put your lipstick on, or don't wear that dress, or do your hair properly. I mean, she's kind of so yeah, but it definitely brought us closer. And
the dialogue continues. Would you like to read out a sonnet or two?
Yeah,
it'd be lovely to hear them.
So I think I'll read one from when she went into remission. So in 2020, she was in remission for a few years, so this is late May 2020. You and your garden resisting lockdown beneath a thatch of birdsong, bristling with escapee coos, fugitive whistles. Your feral spirit bursting through coup d'etat of foxgloves, monkshood, salvia the colour of pomegranates held by Christ children, their mothers gazing forward to the Passion. So once you gazed at me, so now I. No, let's retell. My Madonna is a fighter, rejecting dead men's histories, watching lemon light on sapling birches, the golden moss of bumblebees, their delicate, obsessive turning, learning to count time as grains that whirl, not flow, spinning us back to love's defiant zero.
Now, I know you live in a beautiful part of the world. You live a beautiful part of the UK in Shropshire. Did your mum live near you, or was she in a completely different part of the country?
No, my mum lived in Shropshire. I mean, the reason I'm in Shropshire is because of my mum. So my parents moved to Ludlow, which is the town in Shropshire where they live, in 2014. And it was just after she had gone into remission. So she had the first bout of cancer, had treatment. They were living on a small holding in the countryside. And she was, my mother was Jewish, but she was very secular, but she bred pigs. I mean, she was a very paradoxical character. She was never doing what she was meant to do. And she was a kind of natural rebel. So they lived on this small holding. They had pigs and sheep and cows. And then the cancer came the first time round, and obviously she was very bedbound for quite a long time. So she realized they had to sell up. They sold a little farm and they moved into the town of Ludlow in Shropshire, which is a really pretty town. It has this river running through it called the River Team. And yes, so when she fell ill the second time and the cancer came back in January 2021, I basically moved down there to nurse her. So I nursed her through her last months. She died in June. And then I stayed on, really on and off I stayed on fairly permanently for a year, helping my father, who was navigating obviously a very terrible grief. And then after a couple of years, I started to move back to London, where I spend quite a lot of time, and also Italy, where I try and spend as much time as possible. But Ludlow is still my main residence, and my father sadly has had to go into a care home just in the last 6 months. But yeah, so her home has become my home, and I look after her garden, I cook in her kitchen. I mean, it sounds like I'm turning into her, but I curiously kind of know I'm not. I mean, that a psychoanalyst would have a field day with all of this, I know, but I actually feel weirdly like it's all fine, it's all good, it feels right and natural, and kind of where I'm meant to be.
And your father does make some appearances in the sonnet sequence as well. I believe he's an academic.
He is an academic. He was a political scientist, and he was teaching up until lockdown. So he's 93 now, and at 90 he was still taking seminars. And because he's not digital, he couldn't do anything on Zoom. He refused to. We said we'd teach him, but he just said no. But he's still writing reviews for academic journals, and I think he's still supervising a PhD student. He's. I could read the sonnet that's particularly about him, if you like.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Yes, please do.
These, needless to say, these are the ones he kind of likes best. He doesn't say that, but when he reads it, he always says, "Oh, there's one about me."
You see, people like it. They pretend not to, but they like being written about, I think.
Well, it's a real. I mean, that is such a test. I mean, how you write memoir and how you stay in the side of the light. And certainly with these sonnets, I had no doubt that was what I wanted to do. I'm not saying I'm always going to do that, but at the moment. So this is still really, my mother is still in remission. Ledge days, leek white, unreckoned. Love thickening like flour and milk over our low blue heat. If I hadn't been an academic, I would have been a forester. My father, as we walk the easy access path, my shock salting the sunlight as it corrugates the pine's grey verticals. When I tell Mum, she doesn't blink, her fingers crimping pastry around the china birds that crown her favourite pie dish. You dye each other in a marriage. Take on each other's pigments. Together, you are purple, my king and queen of pies and dreams. He's always loved trees.
It's a wonderful thing when parents can still surprise you.
That's such a beautiful thing to say. I remember exactly that, walking with him. It's the walk he always did, and thinking, wow, really? Yeah, absolutely.
Now you have a lovely thing, before we get on to Medea, which we will very shortly, you have a lovely thing, I think it's in the acknowledgements, where you say, really here it is. Venice, yoga and wild swimming are recipes for happiness.
Yeah.
And just to look briefly at this collection, there's some lovely poems about Venice. How did your association with that remarkable city begin?
Oh, well, I mean, the short story is I went for a month in January 1999 and I stayed for 9 years because I just thought, why would you leave? And because it was the beginning of the digital revolution. So at that point, I was working as a copywriter for, I was working for Electrolux, writing about fridges. It was very kind of glamorous, but it was, I could do it anywhere. So I went to Venice with my laptop and a mobile phone, plugged them into each other, and sent my copy to where I had to go. And I just fell in love with the city, as so many people do. But because I was genuinely freelance, and because now digital media gave me the chance to live anywhere, it just, I just knew that was something I wanted to do. And it wasn't really, it was pre-Brexit, so you could just move there as a resident. I registered as a resident. And I moved there permanently in 2002, and I stayed until 2011. And I wrote different things. I mean, when I started, I've been in Britain as well as copywriting. I was increasingly doing employment journalism, but obviously I couldn't write about that in Italy, because I couldn't write in Italian. I spoke Italian, but I could never write to publish in Italian. So I had to reinvent myself, and it took a few years, and I did some design journalism and travel journalism. And through design journalism, I realized that I loved writing about what things look like and describing things. And so that was really how I ended up moving into arts journalism, which was my main career. And I started reviewing art exhibitions in Italy, mainly for the Financial Times, and it was wonderful. And I kind of gave myself a little art history degree because I hadn't studied art history. I studied literature at university, but I had a kind of library of art history books in my apartment for various reasons, in both English and Italian. And I just used to get up at 4 a.m. in this beautiful, I had a sort of little kind of piano nobile with high ceilings and big windows. And it was very cheap because it was completely unrestored. So only someone who had very low standards of domestic needs, if you like, would stay in it. The kitchen and the bathroom were pretty, to call them basic doesn't kind of get close. But the light was amazing. There was a canal, it was quiet. And I just used to wake up at 4 a.m. and read art history books. And I just sort of did a little kind of degree in art history. And it was one of the most beautiful periods of my life. And then in Italy, there was contemporary art, but there was also a lot of Renaissance art exhibitions. So I would travel around going to, write about, I don't know, Bellini or Titian or Bruegel. I mean, there would be exhibitions that weren't just Italian artists. In the Veneto, where some of the great Renaissance Italian painters came from, like Cima da Conigliano. He comes from a town called Conigliano. He was a contemporary of Bellini. So lots of Madonnas and the Baptism of Christ, those kind of wonderfully sort of traditional Christian paintings. But, I remember going to Conigliano and reviewing a show of paintings by Cima da Conigliano in Conigliano. So you could look at the landscape, the sort of castle on the hill and the little river and the green fields. And then you could look at his painting where he'd done the Baptism of Christ. And that was the landscape he painted, because they painted what they saw. And that was a pretty extraordinary privilege. And it gave you I think it gave me a sense of kind of Christian painting, Christian Renaissance painting, that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't been there. Also, you saw the paintings in the churches. So that Baptism of Christ by Cima, I don't think that actually went to Conigliano. I think that stayed in the church that it was painted for, which was my local church in Venice. So I would just go into that church like 2 minutes down the road and sit in front of this masterpiece. But what was also really interesting was that as I got to know more local people, many of whom were Catholics, practicing Catholics, they would go to church to take mass. And for them, this painting by Cima da Corneliano of the baptism of Christ was an object of worship in the tradition of an icon. And they would pray to it. And that also was really moving and important for me to understand that these paintings were, that their theology within them was crucial, I think, to how you feel them and read them. And quite a lot of traditional art history, Western secular art history, just kind of slightly leaves that out because it's not. I don't think you have to be a practicing Christian to understand them, be moved by them, and write about them. But I think I found it really interesting as well to delve a little bit into the theology of Catholicism and Christianity, especially at that period. So Venice was Venice is such an extraordinary place, and it goes on bewitching me. And I the more you live there, the more you see differently. You see different things in the city. Every time I go, I notice different views, different aspects of it. I wrote a poem, a sort of prose poem, in the first month of lockdown, just before lockdown, February 2020. I was in Venice for the whole month. And I wrote a poem in which I said, it's a city which teaches you to notice the beauty of the offset, the crooked, because everything's on an angle in Venice. It's medieval, essentially. It's not all classical and straight like the Renaissance. It's the opposite of kind of clean modernist lines. But I'd never noticed that before. I mean, I had, but I hadn't. And then suddenly I was walking around the city on my own, and I just suddenly saw all these sort of anti-geometries. And that goes on happening. The more I'm there, the more it kind of nourishes me.
I think that's what Ruskin liked. I mean, if you read The Stones of Venice, he chucks out most of what we would say were absolutely remarkable buildings, because he doesn't like that Renaissance thing of straightness and strictness. He actually likes the sort of organic life of the medieval buildings, doesn't he? And so I remember I didn't read the whole thing. I read a kind of selected rants by Ruskin, but he's got that offset thing, hasn't he? Very definitely.
Completely. Ruskin there were lots of issues around Ruskin, far from perfect person, but he really got, I think, that medieval magic of Venice. He writes a whole chapter on windows and on the notion of the ogee arch, which is this pointy arch. And that, there's an extraordinary architectural historian called Deborah Howard, who wrote a book called Venice in the East, which I really recommend to anyone who's interested in this.
Was it published by Yale? I think I have it. I've sort of flicked through it. Beautiful. Yeah, wonderful illustrations. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Deborah Howard has really tracked the way those early Venetian architects in the kind of 11th, 12th, 13th century were looking not so much at European architecture or even Byzantine architecture, so from Constantinople, but at Islamic architecture in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, because that's where the galleys were going. So that Tridley Arch, I think actually is partly from that area. There's a kind of crisscross, and there's all kinds of bits of Venetian architecture. So there's something called the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, which is used to be the post office, and now so Fondaco is the word. It comes from an Arab word funduk, and it means kind of warehouse or caravan, where the merchants, the German Tedeschi means Germans. The German merchants would come and stay and sleep and store their goods as well when they were trading in Venice. So Venice has several funduks, but that kind of thing, that crossover. So you get Arab language in Venetian dialect. I love all that. And Ruskin, he talks about the arabesque, which I think now arabesque is considered a problematic term because it has, I think, originated in the West. But in terms of the concept of understanding how Arabic architecture and also social ways of living in the city, so the way the streets are constructed, so you have a street for, I don't know, gold sellers, and you have a street for saucepan sellers, and open air water gates. So every palace has a water entrance onto the canal, and it's sort of open with like thin columns. You can moor your boat. That also resonates in Arab cities, in medieval Arab cities. So I think all of that, I still find all of that absolutely fascinating. And and Ruskin, I think what I love about Ruskin, he was so passionate about Venice. I think it's a city that deserves our passion.
How easy is it to transition from the kind of tourist in Venice to, oh wow, I actually live here, I have to, buy loo roll and milk and things like that? And is it a welcoming city in that sense?
Well, that's kind of the $1 million question. It's actually really hard. I mean, it was really hard. The transition, and it's why the city's so interesting, because how it is when you're a tourist or even a visitor for maybe a few weeks or even a few months is completely different from when you live there. And I couldn't know that because I'd never done it before. But when you live there year in, year out, well, particularly, I mean, I think it depends who you are, but I was a young woman in my early 30s. I'd come from London. I was quite ambitious as a journalist. I was quite used to kind of, hustling my way through challenges, and I had goals and I wanted outcomes, and Venice was like, good luck with that. Venice is, people I would say that the Venetian people on the whole, or the residents there, you have to be born and bred Venetian, are incredibly welcoming and helpful and kind, like people are most places, if I'm honest, I think, on a good day. But it's not an easy city to live in. It's quite a hard city. I say that in a poem somewhere too. This is a hard city because you've had centuries of invaders, whether it's sort of armies trying to invade or
Napoleon.
Napoleon was the only one who actually got there. Horrible Napoleon. Although he did liberate the Jews in the ghetto, so we have to say that was a good thing. And then obviously tourists, millions of them, and then the constant environmental danger, the tides. So Venetians have to live there, you have to be resisting constantly these kind of invasive forces. And that makes people very robust and quite steely. And one of the things I learned, and it was probably one of the best lessons I ever learned, was to soften. Because I went there thinking I could sort of hustle my way through things, very sort of London, kind of like, get things done the way I wanted them. And I really quickly learned I couldn't. And the only way to get things done was to be nice and ask nicely and accept that, it might not happen straight away. And it would help if you could speak the language properly. But even if you spoke the language properly, it didn't mean that they weren't going to prioritize somebody who really was a local. And I came to understand that as well, that, you had to kind of earn your right to be considered a local. So if I went to the greengrocers to buy, we went to the supermarket to buy loo roll, but there was a little old lady, and the little old ladies in the supermarket, fantastic. They turn up in their fur coats with their little baskets, and they literally just push to the front of the queue because they're so weary of all the tourists in the way. I love them. I just let them go. It was a city that taught me to wait and to be patient. And these days, I'm, as you may have seen with Daughter of the Sun, the notion of time is really important to me. And I'm always on the kind of hunt for slow time, for more and more kind of slow time in a world where I feel like we're being increasingly kind of encouraged to rush and hustle. And Venice is somewhere where you kind of tap into slow time. And that doesn't mean that the city is inefficient, because actually the Vaporetti the water buses that go around, unless everyone's on strike, they're really efficient. They come on time. They always let you on. You have to give up your seat to the old ladies. I think that's as it should be. But it is a city where you walk everywhere. It has a kind of human dimension. And so one of the reasons I love being there is I feel myself kind of step into what I would consider a human time, which I feel is increasingly, at stake in so many places in the world. So yeah, I think it was the making of me as a human. It made me grow up living in Venice. And it still does. It's also a very collaborative city. I think if you live in small towns, I feel this in Ludlow as well. If you live in small towns, you have to work with people. You depend on each other. And you have to know the right person to call to help you out with somebody, and it's really important that people think you're a nice person, because if they don't, if your house floods, as it may in Venice, you need someone who will help you sort that out. And that's just a good lesson for life. I think it made me a nicer person, because so it's a very extraordinary place.
Had you always written poetry?
I started writing poetry at school. I think I read poetry. My parents were readers. They both loved poetry. My mother loved John Clare. My father loved poets like Auden and Isherwood, and the war poets like Wilfred Owen. So there were always books of poetry around. And, it's a kind of classic story. I had a very inspiring English teacher. He would, at school, at high school, he would tell us to write poems. He was always encouraging about mine, and said, "Oh, you keep going." And I think he made me feel like I could write. And then at university, I discovered some of the poets who originally kind of influenced me, like Adrienne Rich. Wasn't such a great idea, because she's a great political poet, and political poetry. I mean, I do a little bit of poetry with an evident politics in it, but only when I've learned to like. It's not everyone can do that. But yes. So then I just started writing. I wrote all through my 20s. I published in some magazines. Then I did a master's when I was 30 at Queen Mary in London, and that academic world just knocked all the poetry out of me for about 4 years. It was a disaster. But being back in Venice, I started to write again, and read again. I mean, the most important thing, I think, for being a poet is reading other better poets.
I just remembered that there is a poem in Furies after Adrienne Rich, which is the poem about Francesca Woodman.
Yeah.
How does that work? Did Adrienne Rich write a poem about Francesca Woodman, and you sprung off from that? Because Woodman is a fascinating figure.
Yeah, she's absolutely amazing. I've got the poem actually. It's also in my first collection. So no, Adrienne Rich wrote a fantastic poem called "The Fact of a Door Frame," which became the title of her collection. I've actually got it here. Do you want me to read it? It's a great poem.
Yes.
I'll read hers.
Adrienne, yeah. Please.
Yeah. Here we are. So Adrienne Rich wrote this poem in 1974. The fact of a door frame means there is something to hold on to with both hands, while slowly thrusting my forehead against the wood and taking it away. One of the oldest motions of suffering, as Makeba sings a courage song for warriors. Music is suffering made powerful. I think of the story of the goose girl who passed through the high gate where the head of her favourite mare was nailed to the arch, and in a human voice, If she could see thee now, thy mother's heart would break, said the head of Falada. Now, again, poetry. Violent, arcane, common. Hewn of the commonest living substance into archway, portal, frame. I grasp for you, your blood-stained splinters, your ancient and stubborn poise, as the earth trembles, burning out from the grain. So, yeah, so that was her great poem with a very clear kind of politics, almost of despair in it. I think poetry is some kind of, possible light beacon in the darkness of a politically desolate landscape. But the fact of a door frame, I had always been fascinated by thresholds and doors, as many poets are, I think. And there is a photograph of Francesca Woodman, who was this extraordinary photographer, died very young, tragically, who would photograph herself often naked in rooms, holding onto a door frame, naked, hanging in the door frame. And she photographs in black and white. So she sort of almost looks like a ghost. And I always found that photograph incredibly compelling. And I kind of I felt like that's me in that photograph. I know what it's like to hang there on the threshold naked. And I think many people will understand that. So when I wrote a poem entitled The Fact of a Door Frame, means there is something to hold on to. And shall I read it?
Please
I've got it about my person. I've got a fury somewhere, but I've got a bird of sorrow here. For Francesca Woodman, after Adrienne Rich. The fact of a door frame gave you something to hold on to as you moved through the world skinless, wearing your broken runes like water. You propped Euclid on your pillow, turned your lens on his mute glass eyes, finding infinity in fugitive corners, pockets of grace in imprecise angles, prowling those parched thresholds like a cat seeking sunlight. Less narcissist than pilgrim child, undressing the elements like dolls.
Wonderful poem.
Thank
and
you.
I think that's probably the accusation that is thrust at particularly women writers, artists who take the self as their subject, that it's narcissistic somehow, rather than, as in fact you're doing in Daughter of the Sun, a really deep dive into what's dark as well as what is pleasant and nice and light. I think Don Patterson also wrote a series of poems about Francesca Woodman, and that was odd. Yeah, he did. I can't remember which collection it is. I'll look it up. But, it's actually it's how I came across her, which is a kind of strange way in, through Don Patterson of all people alerting me. But yes, he's written a series of poems in one of his collections. I'll dig it out and send you.
Please, that would be great. Yeah.
Really interesting. So I want to move on now to Medea, girl, goddess, queen, and she is, of course, daughter of the sun. I mean, it's very, very interesting in a way. The sonnets are very different to the Medea long poem that almost feels like a performance piece. Very powerful piece, but how do you see them fitting together? Because it does work putting them together.
Thank you so much for saying that, because it was a wager that both I and Emma Press took on putting them together. Well, I mean, so Medea, known in history as the woman who killed her own children in revenge for being betrayed by her husband Jason, who was Jason of the Argonauts. So obviously the ultimate anti-mother in history. I was always fascinated by Medea. My mother used to take me to the theatre all the time, but she loved Greek tragedy. So we must have seen Medea together about 6 times. We saw Diana Rigg, we saw the wonderful Helen McCrory, who tragically died. I think we saw Fiona Shaw. We saw a Medea on silks, on like acrobatic Medea by Tamsin Shasha. Tamsin Shasha played her. Anyway, Mum and I always loved Medea, which was quite weird when you think about it. So how I saw them fitting together was, so my Medea, I was always fascinated by Medea. The more often I saw it performed in the theatre, the more I felt she was a kind of transcendent figure, because as anyone who's ever seen the play will know, Medea is primarily furious. Her anger is absolutely central to who she is. And she kind of burns through this play like a comet until she builds up to this terrible act. But she's also really clever. And actually during the play, various characters describe her as a clever woman. And I think the nurse, who is part of the chorus, actually says, it's sort of like Yeats's Prayer for My Daughter, don't let your women be too clever, because they're so dangerous if they are. And Medea also, she doesn't just survive, she thrives at the end of the play. So she exits the play in a chariot pulled by dragons. That's the stage direction. Not every director does it,
No.
But you would expect her to die and be punished, as happens in tragedies. And then in subsequent myths I discovered, Medea also thrives. So she goes on to marry Aegeus, who's the king of Athens, who kind of rescues her in the play and gives her a place of exile. But I think she becomes his mistress in one myth. And then in the afterlife, she's said to have married Achilles, who is the great Greek hero. So it's like she gets the guy, she gets the prince. So the more I kind of, the more I saw the play, whenever I saw the play, I would come out of the theatre feeling that something had feeling liberated, was how I used to feel. I used to think, here is a woman who makes anger not just acceptable, but something almost triumphant. And I think as women, we are taught constantly not to be angry. And it's not a manifesto for anger. The book certainly isn't a manifesto for anger. But I do believe there are really good reasons to be angry in the world, both as women and men. And sometimes anger can be a transformative force. So there was this sense that Medea's anger was something that could kind of carry you through to a different reality. And at the same time, I started to read about quantum physics. And quantum physics is obviously a space where time and space and matter don't do what they're supposed to do and behave in an almost occult way. And Einstein actually described the quantum world as one of witchery. And Johannes Kepler, who was a 16th century scientist, his mother was tried for witchcraft. So as I kind of absorbed more and more of this quantum dimension, and Medea was just always there in my head. And I started thinking, well, what if Medea, rather than being, a vengeful mother and wife, what if she had never had any children? What if she was a childless, child-free woman at a time when that was not acceptable, and she was clever, and maybe she had an inkling of the quantum world? I'm a poet, I can make things up. That's one of the things I love about poetry. No one fact checks you. No one says that's not realistic. So I thought, what if she was bending time and space and matter using science? How frightening would that make her to a world dominated by men, for men, run by and for men? So I started thinking about the original Medea as being maybe some kind of warning tale. And I didn't want to fact check any of this because I wanted to use my poet's head, because I wanted to write this poem about some kind of internal liberation as much as anything. And so how it ties in with my mother is, all those reasons, on a simple level, the mother and the anti-mother. On another level, that, motherhood is one aspect of who we can be as women, but we can be other things too. And my mother was the first person to say that. I chose not to have children. My mother was completely fine with that. She was never a mother who put pressure on me to have children. And I hope in the sonnets, that kind of freedom that we had with each other to let each other be other. I think that's one of the other things. Your mother is your mother, but she's also like someone else completely doing her own thing. And I love that about her. And to be fair, she always loved that about me, that I wasn't always her daughter. So for me, the long Medea poem is really, the more I read it and the more I talk about it, the more I realize this is a poem of freedom, about freedom and risk. And a friend of mine who loved the poem, actually, but she wrote to me and she said, I love this. There is nothing to hold on to. And I kind of wanted that. I didn't know I did at the time. I mean, I wrote it in a very particular kind of state. It was very kind of thoughtful. I didn't write it fast, but I wasn't trying to do anything in particular. I just needed this voice to come through me. But yeah, I wanted this feeling. I think looking back, what I wanted was this feeling of being able, I think I wanted to be able to fly. I mean, I think, nothing is freer than a bird. And my first collection was called
or a chariot pulled by dragons.
Or a chariot pulled by dragons.
I think that's probably what you really wanted.
That would have been great. Yeah, I'm waiting for my dragons. I mean, Game of Thrones, I haven't really watched it, but everyone kind of goes, oh, Game of Thrones. So I think there were dragons in that. So yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. Dragons are good. Sometimes, I mean, the dragon, of course, in the paintings of St. George and the dragon, he's always rescuing the princess from the dragon, but maybe she wanted to go on the dragon. I've never thought of that. Maybe she could have jumped on the dragon's back and kind of gone off into the sunset.
Well, there is the famous painting, and I'm not going to be able to remember who it was by, but the princess has the dragon and it appears to be on a collar and chain, as if it's a pet. And she has this vibe of, hey, leave my pet alone. I really don't need you to come and help me with this. I think it's in the National Gallery. I've always loved paintings with dragons in, although they do get a bit of a hard time in the Christian tradition. But to go back to the Greeks, I mean, obviously it was a deeply sexist, misogynist society, and yet the plays do something so interesting about a character like Medea. They give her a good say. They're open. There's just something incredible the way the playwrights had this form where you don't push a message necessarily. I mean, there's messages in there, but I think that's why the play is so brilliant, isn't it? How it could have been written is amazing. Is it Euripides?
Absolutely, it's Euripides.
Yeah.
And I mean, this notion that somehow I always felt like somehow she escaped her own myth writers, and how that exchange works between writer. What was Euripides thinking as he sat there writing Medea? Was he thinking like me, I want to liberate a character? Was he just trying to tell a great story? Did he just, I think the way that play is written, because she gets so much agency, she gets all the best lines, her speeches are fantastic. And it's not just me. I mean, Medea, I wrote an essay about how I wrote Medea, and was looking up some reviews of Medea's in the theatre. And the critics use words like, compelling, seductive, triumphant, intriguing, as well as obviously acknowledging the horror of what, that traditional Medea does. But I mean, I was thinking about Lolita, Nabokov's Lolita, in terms of another writer who reclaims is the wrong word. Nabokov's wager with Lolita, it always seemed to me, was that if I write something well enough, I can make the absolutely irredeemable redeemable. And that was a very extraordinary thing to do. And I think if you haven't read Lolita, you probably can't understand how that can happen. But somehow when you do read Lolita, so and he does, I think, describe it ultimately as his love affair with language. Like, really, it was his love affair with language. Can I make language so beautiful that it can perform this incredible sort of dark conjuring trick? And I think I felt a bit like that with Medea, not my Medea, but Euripides' Medea. Like, somehow his language had kind of escaped. So I guess what my poem does to an extent is it just takes that more liberated Medea and lets her fly, and takes away all the reasons why, we want to condemn her. Because, as I say, my Medea might not have had any children. I quite want to keep all the mights and uncertainties around my Medea, because I want her to feel free to go off and not be trapped by my myth either. But one of the lovely things has been that people have been writing to me, doing lots of the research that I quite deliberately didn't do. And one friend in Italy said to me, actually, there is quite a lot of evidence that Medea was written as a warning tale, that she didn't exist as that kind of figure, but that Euripides was paid to write a warning tale, which was always in my kind of head. And I haven't pursued that yet, also because I still feel like I'm trying to not get too bogged down in the historic threads, but I will pursue it.
I mean, does that mean it'd be good if it was a warning to guys not to treat their wives and partners so badly.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, actually. Well, I will pursue this now and find out. I mean, she sent me some links, and I just thought I don't want to get too distracted by that yet, but I'm going to look at it, when the book's been out for a while. But yeah, I mean, I think, witches, my Medea, there's a line in my Medea where it says how much she hated witchcraft, because my idea was that, she was being portrayed as a witch, but actually she was using science. But of course, witches, women were considered witches who were wise women, who were healers as well. They lived alone, they didn't have children, they lived in the cottage, and they were considered very necessary to society because they could heal. But they were also considered dangerous because they had the secret knowledge. And so I think, we've seen what happens to witches, to women who are accused of being witches, when that threat for whatever reason is considered too strong. But I always thought maybe, if there had been a real Medea, maybe that was the kind of woman she was, in a cottage, like making potions to heal people that were not at all, witchy, that were just knowing her botany. And, that would have, but, we know that sometimes, when certain social political things happen in societies, that's when the witch becomes a necessary scapegoat that you can use to diffuse social unrest. So, was that happening with Euripides and Medea? I don't know. Yeah.
It's the easiest thing to throw at a woman who appears to be too powerful or too clever. Anyway, to say that she's a witch. I always had this idea that Euripides was almost a modernist in terms of what he did. He was looking at very old myths and he's kind of moving away from the play as religious observance to the play as kind of experimental zone to test out ideas and thoughts.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. You're probably far more knowledgeable about the tradition of Greek tragedy than I am. I've just seen a lot of it, but I've never studied it. I've never really wanted to, because I've always felt like if I get too kind of like caught up in what they were doing, I won't be able to do what I want to do. But that makes perfect sense, because there's a sort of cleanliness about Medea, Euripides' Medea. And I mean, the last one I saw was actually the best, and it slightly broke my heart. My mum wasn't there, but I kind of hoped she was watching anyway. And it was Sophie Okonedo.
Oh, brilliant.
I saw that.
Yes.
Wasn't
brilliant.
It amazing? I mean, she was kind of the absolute like apotheosis of what I'm talking about. I mean, she made her anger something so transcendent, so compelling, and also so sort of justified, because Jason, I mean, obviously not justified if she's going to kill her children, but, you know, Jason was gaslighting her. And I think, I mean, I wrote this in 2019 when we were in a very different political situation from what we're in now, certainly, you know, in Britain. But when I wrote this long essay about why I wrote Medea, without at all intending to, I found myself writing about liberation and kind of dissident women and anger as a form of kind of not only catharsis, but kind of bringing about change, catalyzing things, if it is used in a way that is hopefully non-violent and strategic. And of course, in the last, you know, year, since we've seen what's happened, you know, both in Gaza, but also in, you know, countries all over the world, in terms of the crackdown on civil liberties and, you know, political expression, labor organization. And we've seen this rise in protest. You know, we've seen strikes, we've seen manifestations, we've seen demonstrations. And that's still absolutely continuing. And I didn't expect to be kind of making those connections, because I never felt I was writing a political poem in that sense at all. But as I wrote and of course, so what I was thinking about was this notion of being gaslighted, which we talk about now. But Jason gaslights Medea. He says, if I end up with, you know, if I marry the daughter of the king of Corinth, where they've taken exile, we'll all be safe. And you should accept it. And of course, she's like, you're my husband. You know, you can't, that's not an option. But he makes her feel, or tries to make her feel, as if she's being unreasonable to resist this marriage. And that kind of gaslighting behavior does drive people mad. But, you know, I feel like we're all being gaslighted these days by so many of our politicians who tell us we have to accept things that are unacceptable for our own good, because it will keep us safe, you know.
Well, it's a long poem, challenging in many ways in terms of its thought, but beautiful in its language. Would you like to read a section? And we'll
I'll read a little bit. I'll read a little section from the middle. So this begins as she and Jason flee Colchis, where Medea was born, and where Jason had gone to steal the golden fleece, which belonged to her father, the king. And Medea, in the myth, uses her witchcraft to help Jason steal the fleece. And then they flee together on the Argo, the boat, Jason's ship. What was unsaid? How much she loved the sea. That first journey on the Argo, rising before dawn, the water stirring as if an animal is trapped beneath its folds. Cupped in the stern's curve, the sailors numb to her, as if they know out here she's scoured of all she was. Daughter, sister, princess, witch. She's no one's bride to be. Out here, there's only newness, fairest tongue of sea and sky, trembling, fibrous. You watch and watch, but morning's shy as flowers. This is God's work, and yet, as dawn breaks pieces of infinity over the Argo's sails, she feels the shudder of a different knowing. Is that the scissor kick of gulls' wings, or just a trick of the light? She will land on the other side of outrage, beyond murder, sacrifice, way beyond revenge. Others have come before her, and others will follow. Not all will be seen, but all will see each other. Across epochs, galaxies, light years, archives. Do not call them seers or sisters. They are the owls of history, night flyers, outliers. Wing beats so slow, they unhinge time. A quantum swiftness, porous as ash. They'll teach us to see in the dark.
I love the owls of history.
Thank you.
I remember that
Thank you.
Stuck out to me as I read. So the way that it's written, there is sort of, it's kind of broken up on the page. I mean, that's very different from the sonnet form. And you said something interesting earlier on. You said that, it wasn't written fast. It was written. How did you put it together as a substantial piece?
Well, I put it together over, I think it took me 2 years or even 3 before I was ready to send it out. So I started off with a poem in my first collection called Bird of Sorrow. So the collection's called Bird of Sorrow. And the second poem in it is called Bird of Sorrow 2, but in brackets it says Medea's Song. And I found this voice, and it came to me it was very strange. So that poem looks like this. So it's also all over the page, very spaced out. I was in India, and I had jet lag, and I was awake, and there were these men kind of shouting outside the window. I wasn't frightened, but it was quite an odd moment of being a bit disembodied, just lie there all night with these male voices very nearby. And there were bars on the window, so I knew I was safe, and they weren't at all interested in me. Anyway, this line came into my head, which was, "The bird of sorrow is celibate as ink." And I'd never written anything like that before, and I didn't really know what it was, but I wrote it down. And that was the beginning of these 2 poems, Bird of Sorrow 1, Bird of Sorrow 2. Bird of Sorrow 2 then got entitled in brackets Medea's Song, because I think I'd just seen one of the Medea, I'd seen a production of Medea. And this figure came to me who was, maybe had no children, was beginning to bend time and space. And I started using this very spaced out structure. So when I came to write Medea's Song, the poem in Daughter of the Sun, I was really just trying to let this voice come in. And I used to get up very early in the morning, and I would read whatever poetry I was reading at the time, which I think at the time I was reading quite a lot of Beckett. I was reading Michael Ondaatje. I was reading Paul Celan, who are all quite abstract, in some ways quite abstract poets. Then I would read some quantum physics by Carlo Rovelli, who's this Italian physicist who writes like a poet and actually uses Dante a lot, the kind of being guided by Virgil through the circles of hell. And so he's very kind of open to like playing with true science and art. So and he's full of metaphors, these fantastic metaphors, like on the edge of a black hole, time stands still, so beautiful, lines like that. So I would just plunder him, really. I still do, actually. And I would let these different voices just float around in my head, and then I would write, and I would listen quite often to music by my partner, who's a contemporary classical composer, who is somebody who tries to get silence into his music. So there's a line in Medea about the silence, always she loved the silence between notes. And Michael, my partner, talks a lot about trying to put silence into music. So when I was writing early in the morning, I would just try and let the concepts of silence and space and kind of solitude kind of inhabit me, and how I did the spacing. I mean, I write everything by longhand many times before I print. But I think it was almost like writing it in not a trance, because I was very conscious, but it was very meditative. And I would just feel the space I needed. And they did change. I mean, I did edit a lot. I sort of edited over years, but I think if I went back to the original draft, it would be fairly recognizable. But it did take a long time because, you know, Medea wasn't always there. She wasn't always there to, like, you know, and I did feel like she used to tap into. And yeah, what's quite annoying, but it's really, I do this all the time with my poems, and I think other poets do, is I'm still editing. So although we edited and it went through lots of drafts, again, very kind of sensitive drafts. Emma James and Emma at the Emma Press were fantastic editors. I was also mentored by a wonderful poet called Ella Frears, who, do you know Ella?
Oh, yes. Did she do Good Lord?
Yes.
Yes, which I haven't read, but yeah, I should read.
She's a fantastic writer, but also a fantastic teacher. And Ella and I were on a course together with Mimi Calvati, who is the absolute queen of all form, but she's wonderful at sonnet. So she taught me a lot about sonnet writing. Ella and I took that course together, and then by some weird Medea-like serendipity, I bumped into her on the station changing trains on the way to Ludlow at Newport, where she was on her way to do a reading at the Arvon Centre. So we were like, hi, how are you? And I was looking for somebody to read Medea before I sent it out to a publisher, because I knew it needed to have I was too close to it. And I just thought, you're perfect, because she's a very experienced teacher. She's a wonderful poet. And I wanted someone who would really critique it. And she didn't make a lot of changes, but the changes she made were crucial. And I'm really grateful to her. There were things like the voice I use. So sometimes I talk about you, I, and I know who I'm talking to, or when I'm, when the I is Medea and when the you is Medea, and I would shift between those. But of course, that's exactly where you need a reader to say, I don't know who you are, because she doesn't know. So she made those kind of changes, and then just a few little tweaks. But she was, so I think often when you're editing poetry, it's about finding the right person. You don't need a lot of people, but you need the right people. So yeah, so that was, I think it sat in a drawer for a year before I showed it to Ella. I think that was when my mum got ill and I was busy with her. And then I was also writing lots of sonnets. So I was writing sonnets at the same time. So I think I had a year more or less writing sonnets, and then it was time to take Medea out of the drawer. And then I met Ella and kind of.
And did you have this sort of moment where you thought, they go together? These different things actually do go together, and then you have a book, right?
Actually, it was, well, it was a conversation with Ella. It wasn't quite a light bulb moment. What happened was Ella said, Medea's one poem, you want it to stay together. Are you thinking of a pamphlet? And I said, yes, maybe, but it's really time I produce a collection, because it's been, I think, 4 years since my last collection. I produced a couple of pamphlets in the interim. And also I just, I don't know. And so anyway, I just said to Ella, I don't know. I said, yes, I could be a pamphlet. Also, I said, I've got a lot of poems that some have been in magazines, but they haven't been in a collection. I said, I've got all these sonnets about my mum. It's kind of like another sequence. It's about 27, I think. I can't remember how many there are now. And she just went, that's it, do that. And I just thought, yeah, I think I will. And then I sent them to Emma, at Emma Press. who published Call and Response, the first lot of sonnets about my mum. And she just was like, yeah, great. You know, so it didn't sort of, I never really queried it. There's lots of like orphan poems out there that I've written in the interim that need a home, but I'm not worrying about that at the moment.
No, it's got a unity to it. This
thank you.
collection.
Thank
it's
you
sort
so
of
much.
Thematically satisfying, and they speak to each other in weird ways. You know, the two halves.
Well, the quantum time is also very much in the sonnets. I mean, it's in me now. I just think about time a lot. And so I talk about the river as, you know, in terms of being a space that expands time, that kind of, I talk about it being a thin place, so somewhere that you can cross from life and death. It's a threshold space. So I think I'd start quite a lot of the sonnets with the early ones. I talk about Hinge Week between equinox, which is actually now, it's like this day almost, it's the equinox, isn't it? It's lovely, that Hinge Week between equinox and change of hour, when my mum was still well, was ill but alive. So and then I talk about, you know, in Medea, like the wings unhinging time. There were a couple of repetitions which I took out, although one reviewer said she actually liked where she saw like linguistic synergy between the two sequences. She really liked that. But there were a couple. I talk about the green bone of the sea, and I talked about the green bone of the river, and it was only on the final edit that I saw that I'd repeated myself. And it could have stayed there as a synergy, but I actually took it out and changed the green bone of the river to cold bed or something. Now I think maybe I should have left it in. You know, there's quite a few of those. I noticed them more and more. In fact, owls, you mentioned owls. So I hadn't realized, but owls were a big deal for me and my mum. The first sonnet in my childhood is about us seeing owls at midnight, late one night. And it was a very mystical moment for us. I was 8, she was older than that. And then the owls of history, and I hadn't seen, but that's a synergy. I mean, I believe in those. I think one's unconscious or God or whoever kind of gives you those synergies.
We talked a bit about thresholds. I actually think Newport Station is quite an important threshold. I mean, I go up to the Ludlow a lot, and you seem to spend a lot of time on Newport Station, probably having just missed a train, or your train has been delayed, or something has happened, and it's one of those little breaks in life. I'm here. I'm at Newport. I'll be here a while.
That is so true. I never thought of that. And you bump into really interesting people. Like, it's so lovely that I hadn't thought of that. He said, next time I'm there. Well, actually,
I was in the lift with somebody who worked on the station. I think she was wheeling cakes around or something like that. And I'd said, oh, you know, trains, something's happened. Like, there's a fire, there's a trackside fire. Oh, I'm stuck here. And she went, oh, is that what they're saying today? Which I thought was hilarious.
Yes. No, we'll remember that, won't we?
Yeah.
Well, I actually wrote in my diary, because I keep a diary on my phone all the time, sitting at Newport, comma, cosmic waiting. So literally last week I wrote that, because it just felt like, so
And there's also the wonderful Goldie Looking Chain, the Welsh rap group, and they have a song called I'm You're Not From Newport. And I kind of sing it. I sing it to myself in this you know, it's probably more hermetically sealed than Venice, I think. So
I'm going to look it up. I'm going to look that song up.
It's very funny. Okay, let's move on. I feel a bit sort of mean saying favourite artwork. You have worked in the art world for so long.
It's really easy for me to answer that.
Oh, good, go for it.
Well, it's I mean, it's not that easy. I could, but actually it's just very obvious. I've lost the postcard now, but it's this lady. So this is
bring it close. Oh, right. Yes. Yes, I've seen that before. Yes, go on. Is it, that's not Antonio Damascena or whatever?
This
Yeah.
is, yeah, absolutely. So this
Amazing
is, she's
painter.
called L'Annunziata, and she's the Antonello Damascena.
And that's why
Antonello Damascena.
It's in this, isn't it? Is it in this?
Yes.
So that's why he's on my mind. I'm not so brilliant that I'm up on Renaissance and.
No, because he's not nearly as famous as he should be, and as people like Titian and Bellini. But I saw this painting in Sicily, in the museum where it is. Can you still hear me?
Only very vaguely. Try and bring it back.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry about that. Yeah, my earphone
in Sicily.
My earbud fell out. Yeah, and it's a very unusual painting because it's called L'Annunziata, which means essentially the Madonna in the act of receiving the Annunciation. So normally you would see the Madonna with the angel Gabriel in front of her, and she's usually looking rather meek and mild and going, "Ooh," as she's being told that she's going to receive the seed of God to bear this child. But this Madonna, who was painted in the 15th century, is all alone in this black space. You can't see the angel. She looks very modern. She's extremely serious. And she has this hand up above her lectern, which has her Bible on it. And when I saw it the first time, I was still very much doing my art history degree, and I knew a lot less about art history than I do now. Not that I'm an expert now, really, but so I just responded to it as anyone. And what I saw was a woman saying, "Hang on a minute," just the way you would if somebody said, do you want to have a drink? Hang on a sec, let me have a think about it. And that hand, to me, I mean, I've looked at it now for over 10 years. It's still saying to me, "Hang on a minute." And then behind her, she has all this black space. Now, there are art historical reasons why a painting like this might have been done. He might have been riffing on the tradition of icons. He'd painted a previous artwork of a saint, Saint Eulalia, also against black. But it was very unusual to paint a portrait like this, essentially a portrait. It was probably painted in about 1470-ish, 1470 and 1475. And I could go on about it forever, but he's using geometry. He's using Euclidean geometry, classical geometry, to get all these straight lines, to get the depth through her fingers, through the lectern. It was a new thing. The painters had only just understood how to paint classical perspective. So he's using this classical perspective to give this figure authority. And I just found it completely fascinating and moving. And I wrote a sequence of poems about L'Annunziata, which is also the heart of my first collection, Bird of Sorrow, in which she is a woman who maybe says no, who chooses, who demands the right to choose, but also may have been Antonello's lover, because I discovered that some art historians believe he could have painted it in Venice. Although he was Sicilian, he travelled about, as they do, and it's thought he was in Venice. And Bellini is thought to have been quite influenced by Antonello, because Antonello was older than Bellini, one of the first painters to use oil. He used to mix oil and tempera. I think this is oil and tempera. Yeah, it is. And so there I was, in Venice, although I was visiting Sicily. So I felt like, she had sort of come home to me in a way. And it's also, if I'm honest, she is the seed also in many ways of Medea. That same sense of this woman floating in space, having some kind of freedom, some kind of agency, defying all kinds of stereotypes. There's a line by Adrienne Rich where she says, "When does a life change direction, bend towards freedom?" I think I put that in one of my poems about the Annunziata, because actually when I saw her in Sicily, I felt my own life take a turn towards something more exhilarating. I was quite sad at the time for various reasons. I'd separated from one partner. I was having difficulties with another relationship. And it was like she gave me permission to make some choices. And, it wasn't a linear kind of response. I didn't kind of go, I'm going to change all of these things. But it was like she would always be there, kind of just suggesting there was more choice than I thought there was. So that is I think my favorite artwork.
How an artwork can change you. Wow. And then what is your book of shame? And I'm not seriously suggesting shame. It's just my funny title.
Yeah, God, I've got so many. I mean, I don't do shame. Certainly not over books. But there are so many books I haven't read that I should have read. Crime and Punishment, Ulysses. I have never finished a book by Virginia Woolf. Yeah. No, a room of my own, Room of One's Own. I love that, but I've never finished any of her novels. I'm bad, very, very bad. I tried to read Ulysses and couldn't get through it.
A lot of people say that. I would say that's the number one. So
it's so very boring of me, isn't it? Well, maybe that's...
No, I think we're going to banish the concept of shame when it comes to Ulysses. I'm wondering whether it's a book that people pretend to have read rather than actually reading now, because, it has... Do you think it's the status that is off-putting?
I just found the language really impossible. I just didn't, there was nothing for me to, I profoundly don't believe in the notion of shame with books. I think, art is, as someone who's been a so-called art critic for over 20 years now, I'm increasingly convinced that it is totally subjective. I do absolutely believe criticism can bring something, and has value and is valid, but not in terms of going, this is good, this is bad, you must see that, you must read that. No, it's about saying, I found this really interesting and this is why, and that might be interesting for someone. And if a book doesn't take you, it doesn't take you. And we know, goodness, how the canon was so exclusive and excluding. So, I think if there's shame, it's about all the books that we don't know about because they weren't written by, in those days, dead white men, or didn't get a chance to be written because it was quite hard to write things if you weren't an alive white man. But all of that I find and I also think, I hope that on the whole we find what we're meant to find. I guess the river for me is, I like this notion of flow, that we flow through life on a good day and find the poems we're meant to find, and the paintings and the people to talk to, and
Perfect. So finally, have you got any funny or bizarre feedback to share, really, on any aspect of your work? I mean, writing for a newspaper, you can get some quite strange responses, I've found, to things that you write, but it could be your poems or also your non-fiction book, Battle for the Museum.
The non-fiction, that provoked some pretty strong reactions.
I'll bet.
Well, one reviewer of Battle for the Museum took great exception to the fact that I quoted my yoga teacher, which I loved for so many reasons. So I have a yoga teacher who is my teacher, who's Emi Takahashi Tal. She's in the acknowledgements of every book I write. But I was practicing with another lovely teacher, who a young man who teaches drama and musical theatre, and he said, I want you to practice today in the space between magic and cynicism. And I thought, I love that, because that's the kind of space I try to inhabit as a poet, but also, if I'm honest, as a journalist, as a writer, as a non-fiction writer. When I'm experiencing art, and also when I'm responding to political situations or, situations of injustice, you need a space, that space for freedom, which is magic or quantum science. And then I wouldn't say cynicism, but I would say critical judgment, where you don't get caught up in the hype, where you don't just believe what you're told, where you resist, you check, you're judicious. So, but I could have said all that in that rather sort of leaden way that I just said it to you, but actually I just think it's much more fun to say, my yoga teacher said, I want to practice in the space between magic and cynicism. And this was how I was trying to think about this particular kind of sort of shift I was calling for in the art world, which is what the core of Battle for the Museum, my nonfiction book, is about. And this particular reviewer said she completely lost me when she started quoting her yoga teacher. And I thought, well, I guess that's the point. I mean, and, like I say, I do feel like it's, you find the books you're meant to find. And the yoga thing is interesting because it is a really important part of my daily life. And I do practice yoga most days for at least probably an hour, not in a disciplinary way, but just in a way that it embodies me. And people have said about Medea, which has made me so happy, that it feels like an embodied poem. So somebody wrote to me and said it's like doing ballet. I felt reading Medea was like practicing ballet. It was so graceful. It was all about movement. And then somebody else asked a question at an event the other week and said, I feel like the poem is like encouraging us to move. I want to dance. And that made me so happy because I hadn't thought about that. But I thought, I do feel like we are embodied creatures, and maybe in Medea's song, because there's so much movement and space on the page, that is obviously kind of reaching people. But I also feel like everywhere in the world, how we live, we're in danger, locked as we are into our little digital screens, wonderful though they are, of losing sight of our embodied, we are our bodies and our minds. So I stand by my yoga, by my yoga quotation.
I mean, it's quite a lot when you to take on board when you're just doing a downward dog, but
Sorry about that. It's just, or you can just do a downward dog.
Shall we get back to our embodied lives? I thought I heard a dog a bit earlier on.
You may well have done. She's been quite good. She's like been in. I mean, I can bring her in to say hello if you like.
I think we'll let her be. Actually, we'll let her moment of stardom slip by. But as I say, we should get back to our embodied lives.
Thank you.
Daughter of the Sun, Furies is what we've been talking about. Thank you very much. And that one. And yes, so much to think about. And we both love Venice. So I will see you in real life soon, I hope. I can't promise to do any wild swimming, but
well, come and have coffee afterwards. Come and just, you don't have to do the swimming bit. Just come and have coffee and cake.
I'll come and knock on your door and have a coffee.
Well, that would be lovely.
Or have a coffee with all of you wild swimmers.
There's a really nice cafe by the river.
I've been to it.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. So
I'll meet you down there.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll meet you down there. I won't bring my cosy.
No,
Thank you very much,
danger of you going in then. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching. We've had a great World Poetry Day. Every day is World Poetry Day around here. Join me next time. I'll find somebody else completely fascinating to talk to, but we've been discussing Medea, Daughter of the Sun, these two wonderful collections. See you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.